She's just said it, you know? I wish I could tell you what it was. Yeah, I wrote it down.
That's like great. Your picture is like really looking good.
Oh, I do remember that. You remember that? I remember when I saw that.
It's all like
yeah. And I think why I had that other air. I was like, so
you know,
yes, I remember. Okay,
So much so that I remember that. Oh, another contraction. Yeah, whatever it was, I said, okay, that's the way to explain it to the students.
yeah. We ended up around 6 months after child separation. I believe there was some drama. It's ongoing, obviously. By the way,
Check your notes.
I will.
If you have gotten your notes on this, I would love it.
I'll let you know.
I was just talking to Deb. You had an opportunity.
Yes. Yeah. No.
Relationship.
Yes.
Watching her have this epiphany of class was amazing. And then she summarized what we discussing, and I thought, and I asked her to see if she wrote down what it was. For some of these sentences, because I said, oh my goodness, she's all she's good.
Related stuff.
I think I remember. I read it all and I got connected to jobs. I'm okay to graduate.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah. When the point was,
It's actually a diagnosis.
And then you put these two together and what is agitation? The look on your face. It was like all of these little fireworks were going off.
yes.
She remembers this moment. I remember this moment, and it was exactly on this topic. So that's why it is. Because she asked me to put it in the section. Did it without being good ideas together.
We'll let you know. Yeah, well, the mic is for more than the recording.
No,
All right, great, thanks. All right, everyone. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. So this is, I'm using this part of the research seminar series that we have every month. And we're, Alice and I and others have put together as, under the auspices of CGPH, but along with the Department Research Committee, this semester seminar series focusing on immigration and health. And the reason we thought this would be an important focus is it's obviously there's been a slew of change in policies over the last 3+ years that have had dramatic impacts on health, and the number is almost too many to name. Whether it's recension of DACA, the ending of temporary protected status for many immigrants, which is leading to challenges for many families, immigrant families in the U.S., whether it's child separation or detention, not providing the flu vaccine in detention centers, which is sort of a known policy, the hygiene issues that go along with that, whether it's public charge, which is changing of the rules about who, the implications of accessing public services, and which ultimately means that many people who access public services may not be eligible for green cards, which may affect, whether our immigrant communities engage with public health insurance and other public services that are part of our public health. On top of issue. And so to start this out, we have Katrina Burgess, who's here from the Fletcher School. And Professor Burgess is an associate professor of political economy at the Fletcher School. So she's has a book coming out called Courting Migrants: How States Make Diasporas and How Diasporas Make States. So her work is really focused on understanding, from a comparative perspective, our larger scale diasporic communities and how there's this crosstalk between countries that happens because of these communities that exist kind of, across borders. And she has numerous book chapters and journal articles on labor politics, remittances, migration, diasporas. And very interestingly, and we're going to see this today, she is the writer and producer of Waylaid in Tijuana, a documentary about Asian and Central American migrants whose journeys to the U.S. are disrupted by shifts in U.S. policy. So very, very relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So she received a BA from Swarthmore, an MA in International Relations from USC, and a PhD from Princeton. She's been a consultant for USAID and served as assistant director of the U.S.-Mexico projects for the Overseas Development Council in Washington, and associate director of the California-Mexico project at USC. So I think it's outstanding to have you, especially with your very broad perspective on migration, to really kick off the series. Thank you. Oh, I should mention the other two things that will happen in this series. One is we're going to have, next seminar series will be Alex Tsai from Mass General Hospital, who will talk about studies he and his colleagues have done looking at how recension of DACA has affected mental health and how they've quantified that. And then after that, there will be a symposium in April, for which we'll write further details, bringing together more of a community perspective on these issues.
Thank you so much to Ram and Alice, particularly for inviting me to this series and for allowing me to launch it, I guess, for this semester. And as Ram mentioned, I'm going to kind of give you a broad overview of some of the changes in migration, and particularly U.S. policy toward migrants. And I'm going to focus on the effects on the U.S.-Mexico border, but specifically on just on the other side. So this film that I've been working on is mostly filmed in Tijuana, so just south of San Diego. And so that's the border that I know best, that I will focus on, but clearly the issues are relevant across the very long U.S.-Mexico border, and particularly at other major ports of entry along that border, several of which are in Texas, Arizona, and Texas. So per my prompt, I'm going to sort of give you this general idea of what's going on with U.S. immigration policy and how it's the impacts that it's having on the everyday lives of the migrants, but also the communities in which they are residing, often in this state of limbo, right? That they don't know what's going to happen, where they're going to go next, what their fate is, and that in itself has health effects, right? Negative health effects. So the first point I want to make, and this tends to get, it doesn't get adequately covered in the media, is that if you look at overall border apprehensions, which are often used as a proxy for the level of undocumented immigration, they have fallen dramatically. We are now at the levels of the 1970s in terms of the number of Southwest border apprehensions, and that's of 2018. I think it's going up again. as the asylum door is basically shut, you're seeing a little bit of an uptick, but still, I mean, relatively speaking, this is not a crisis, right? I mean, I would suggest it was never a crisis, but it's clearly not a crisis now. And yet the rhetoric is all about, oh, you know, we don't have control of our borders, we're being overrun, et cetera. So that's one point of this chart. And then the other point, which is I'm going to focus more on in the rest of the discussion, is the share. So the blue is all migrants who are apprehended, and then they started keeping track of where these migrants were from. And so starting in, I guess it's 2000, the green are Mexicans, and the black is non-Mexicans. Almost a very large share of those are Central Americans. And of those, a very large share are from the so-called Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, which are all very violent, poor violent countries. And so you see a significant increase in the share of these apprehensions that are of Central Americans. And so if you just look at the number of Central Americans, it looks like, woo, you know, it's going way up. If you put it in this broader perspective, it gives you a different picture. In addition to these aggregate numbers, there have been some really interesting changes in the composition. Besides nationality, there's also a change in gender and age, right? So in the old days, in the blue days, if you will, the large majority of those migrants were single young men, right? Crossing alone, labor migrants looking for work in the United States and then sending remittances back home to their families. You start to see a little bit of a diversification in that in the 90s, but it's still predominantly young men. As in the really starting in 2014, when you had the so-called crisis of unaccompanied minors coming across the border during the Obama administration, that was sort of a signal that things were changing. And we've started to see many more women, minors, and families trying to cross the United States. So in that sense, the composition has changed dramatically. And that has all sorts of implications broadly, but also health implications as well, right? Different types of needs and demands that these migrants place on the communities in which they're residing or through which they're passing. And then the other change is it's been a shift from predominantly labor migrants to predominantly people seeking asylum, fleeing violence, domestic abuse, other conditions that we more often associate with forced migration or refugees. And one of the tricky challenges, there are many, but one of them is that the way we think about refugees does not map very well onto the reasons these people are leaving. Because most of them are not leaving because of state perpetrated violence. They're leaving because of violence perpetrated by non-state actors, whether those be gangs or their husbands, or the state is not doing its job. And so that's often how they make an asylum case. The few who are successful is that they belong to a particular group, which you have to, that's one criteria. And you are subject to violence because the state is failing to protect you. But it's a much harder case to make, even though the levels of violence are comparable to wartime circumstances, right? So this is one of the reasons, one of many reasons where we're seeing the asylum door. The asylum door is quite narrow, and then particularly the Trump administration has narrowed it even further, which is what I'm going to spend most of this talk. Whoops. Like that comment. Yeah, most of my time talking about. So in this sense, the U.S., Mexico is even farther behind, but the U.S. wasn't really prepared for the sudden increase, dramatic increase in asylum seekers. So we had not invested, particularly in immigration courts and judges. And, we invested a lot in border control. The Customs and Border Patrol, ICE, their budgets have risen dramatically, particularly since 9/11, but we have not invested in the asylum system. And so the asylum system was sort of caught on the heels, not prepared, even if they'd been open, right? If our government had been open to processing all of these migrants, the system was a little bit overwhelmed. So there's some truth to that. However, The Trump administration has made it worse. However, before I move to the Trump administration policies, there is the last time Congress passed a comprehensive immigration reform was in 1996. And this reform, in many ways, laid the foundation for a lot of the things we're seeing today. So let me just talk about a couple of key provisions within this reform. And this is a long, clunky acronym that stands for, I think it's illegal immigration, and that's problematic. Again, go right. Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. So you can get a sense already of what the tone is, right? And one of the main things that this act did was it criminalized undocumented entry. So it criminalized entry without authorization. So it went from being an administrative crime, and even though I can't think of the word in English, so it wasn't a crime, it was an administrative violation. Jeez, what is wrong with my, to a crime, right? And then another thing that it did is it empowered local law enforcement to cooperate with and in a sense act on behalf of the control apparatus, the federal immigration control apparatus, and lots of towns signed memorandum of understanding with ICE, what became ICE, and this is part of why you see the proliferation of sanctuary cities is in order to avoid that, right? To say, no, we are not going to cooperate with ICE. Our police are going to cooperate with ICE. Other communities have done the opposite, and they've signed these agreements with ICE so that they can, if they stop someone because they're speeding and they find out that they don't have documents, they will call ICE and ICE will come in. Right, so it created this cooperation between the federal immigration authorities and local law enforcement. Yeah.
So this was during the Clinton administration.
Yeah.
The economy was great in 1996. What was the issue? Why did this happen at that particular point? Because this is very key.
I have an answer to that. So a couple of things happened. A major driver, I would argue, is what happened in California 2 years earlier. So in 1994, the California voters passed what was called Proposition 187. And Proposition 187 was a referendum that, if it hadn't been mostly unconstitutional, would have denied immigrants access to healthcare, to welfare. The initial version wanted to deny them access to public education, which is clearly unconstitutional, right? And this was passed by a significant share of the electorate, and they basically got the governor reelected at a time of economic downturn. So the early 90s were not good economically, and then they start to pick up. So one of the things I think that Proposition 187 did was it signaled to the federal government that the people in the states are mad, they're frustrated, they don't think we're doing enough to control our borders. And so I think there's a direct relationship between the passage of 187, how politically useful it was to a Republican governor to get elected, that it sort of sent a message to the federal Congress that if you pass something like this is going to be popular and it's going to calm down the states, right? Who are restless. And that was part of the language. You guys have neglected us, you've left us out to, pay for the education of all these kids. Do something or we'll do it ourselves. And then the other thing that happened is in 1994, I think it was 1994, when I forget what it was called, but the Newt Gingrich crowd.
Yes. Contract.
Yeah, Contract with America, won control of the House. And so that was also the context in which this happened. So it wasn't a democratically controlled House that passed this, but Clinton signed it. So, I mean, and the Democrats were feeling under pressure to join the cry for more border control for electoral reasons. So it was in the context of those politics that this happened.
But also in the context of putting pressure on people who were receiving social services, whether they were immigrants or not, migrants or not.
Yes, exactly. So the welfare reform was right around this time as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was part of a larger sort of set of policies and in a particular political moment. Yes, a good question. So the other thing that becomes really relevant for what I'm going to talk about later is the decision to basically mandating that all asylum seekers at ports of entry would be detained and subject to expedited removal, right? So if you don't have a visa. So again, it's sort of immediately criminalizing asylum seekers. So not just people crossing without documents as labor migrants, but people requesting asylum. What this does is it throws you automatically into the category of making a defensive asylum claim. So there are affirmative asylum claims and there are defensive asylum claims. Affirmative asylum claims are, if you travel on an airplane with a visa and a passport, and in the airport you say, I want asylum. Or a few days later you say, I want asylum. You go to an administrative officer who manages your case. And while you're applying for affirmative asylum, you can petition for subsidiary status, you can petition to bring your family, sort of a much friendlier process. If you're thrown into defensive asylum, that means basically that you're in expedited removal proceedings or deportation proceedings, and you have to appear before an immigration judge. So it's a different, and the chances are much lower that you will be successful. That also places a higher premium in having legal counsel, to which there is no guarantee. And the vast majority of these folks do not have a lawyer. And if you don't have a lawyer, your chances of getting asylum are almost zero. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to detain you, but this applied to people who crossed at legal crossings as well as illegal crossings.
Yes. Yes. If you don't show up with a visa and you request asylum, you're given a credible fear interview. If you don't pass that, you're sent back immediately. If you do, it used to be that you would either be detained until your hearing came along, or you would be released because you have a sponsor. So you'd be able to stay with a sponsor, right? And then that's one of the things I'm going to talk about that has changed. Any other questions? I think that was, yeah, so those are really key points about this legislation that we're still feeling the effects of those today. So now I just want to do a kind of a run through of the major further restrictive policies that have been put into place since the Trump administration came into office. And you've probably heard about at least some of these, right? Zero tolerance got the most press in the United States because it was linked with family separation. It's what kind of unleashed this practice, which is still happening. Well, it's under the radar, and they fudge it so that it's legal, of separating children from their parents. So the idea behind zero tolerance, which was announced by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions in April 2018, was to encourage detention rather than what they called catch and release. So basically to lower the share of asylum seekers who are let go to wait for their hearing. Based on this discourse of, they just disappear, they never show up, they never, they're not really interested in asylum. When in fact, the data that I've seen suggests that if it's made easy enough, they want to show up, they want to be here legally. They don't want to be undocumented. But there's so many obstacles to getting to the place on time, to getting a notice of when your hearing is. There are lots of reasons why people don't make it to their hearings. If they have counsel, it's some very high share who go to the hearings, right? So again, it's linked to having access to counsel. So anyways, this policy was based on this idea that it's a trap, it's fraud. They just want to get here to get a job, and they're pretending to be asylum seekers. So we're going to detain them. And this is I found this statistic, which I found mind-boggling. So apparently in ICE's New Orleans field office, the share of asylum seekers who were granted parole, being let out of detention, fell from 75% in 2016 to 1.5% in 2018. So basically everyone was thrown into a detention center. And then on top of that, what does this have to do with family separation? Well, the reason that it resulted in family separation is you're not allowed to keep kids in jail or in detention centers for extended periods of time. So in order to put the parents in a detention center, which often was a jail, you had to take the kids away and put them somewhere else, put them in a shelter or release them into the hands of a sponsor, and so you get this family separation, right? And their argument was, well, no, we don't want to keep kids in detention, but they're forcefully dragging them away from their families. And then on top of that, there was a new practice of targeting adults with children as a deterrent. Because again, there's this sort of discourse of these people are bringing their kids just because it makes them more sympathetic and they're more likely to get asylum. So as a deterrent, we're going to rip the children out of their arms and separate them. And you can just, imagine the very deleterious health effects of this, the trauma that these kids are experiencing, their parents as well, but particularly the children. So that happened. There was such a public outcry that they ended the practice. They claimed to end the practice of family separation. However, before it was ended, some 3,000 children were separated from their parents until Trump signed an executive order on June 20th, halting this practice. And the practices, as I mentioned, has continued informally, and according to one estimate, as of late 2019, 5,446 children had been separated from their parents. And the other problem, which I'm sure you've read about in the press, is that they lost track of these kids. Right? So even after the practice is ended, the parents can't find their kids. So I mean, it's a travesty on so many levels. So anyway, so that policy was put into place, and the public outcry was so great that they backed away from it. But not to be deterred, they continue to impose obstacles to people seeking asylum and even more gaining asylum. So the next kind of big blow to asylum seekers, which kind of snuck in, and it's less well known, and I'll show you some. I'll show you some statistics around this. Was the so-called metering system, and the metering system was initially put into place in Tijuana when large numbers of Haitians, they had gone to Brazil after the Haitian earthquake because Brazil provided them with special work permits. The Brazilian economy collapsed and they had a political crisis, so tens of thousands of Haitians made their way on this crazy journey through Colombia and Central America and through Mexico, and most of them ended up in Tijuana. And when that happened, the United States, the US government, this was under Obama, decides to limit the number who can ask for asylum any given day. So they were saying, only 50 of you can show up and get a credible fear hearing. So this became known as the metering system. Obama also decided that he was going to deport Haitians who had been granted a kind of humanitarian parole if they arrive without adequate documentation. It's not TPS, it's not the same thing, but it was sort of a different protective status because of the earthquake. That he ended that, and this metering system had been put into place. So you have people waiting around, then the sort of the system emerged where they would get a number, and who controlled the list, who controlled the numbers. It was all very complicated and confusing, and people would go to the port of entry every day to see if their number was going to be called, and then they'd have to go back to the shelter, and the shelters were just full because there were all these people waiting for their number to go and request asylum. And then when after the Trump administration came in, and you start to see a sort of an increase in the Central Americans who are arriving seeking asylum, they sort of reinstituted this policy, the metering policy, for the Central American asylum seekers. So anyway, right? And so again, you have these lists with numbers, And again, I'll show you some statistics on this in a second. So you have the metering systems that's reimposed in the summer of 2018 in all the main ports of entry along the US-Mexico border. Then in December 2018, the official name is Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a misnomer, but the more sort of common usage name is Remain in Mexico. And so this was a policy where they decided that we don't have, our detention centers are overflowing, we're not going to catch and release. So our new solution is that you have to go back to Mexico and wait for your court hearing. And I'll also show you some data and a little film about Remain in Mexico. And then finally, well, most recently, in July 2019, the Trump administration imposed what's known as the transit ban. Which basically says, if you have passed through any other country on your way to the US-Mexico border, you have to have requested asylum there and been rejected, or you're not eligible to apply for asylum in the United States. Well, obviously, all of these people have passed through some other country except Mexicans, right? And then there was a lot of pushback against this by certain quarters, and so the Trump administration, to kind of cover themselves, went on to sign these so-called safe third country agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which is also just, what parallel universe are we living in, right? They're very dangerous countries. They are not safe third countries. We have a safe third country agreement with Canada. That makes sense, right? Mexico refused to sign it, right? They've caved on everything else in terms of controlling migrant immigrants at their southern border, but they refused to sign a safe third country agreement. Nonetheless, the transit ban is still in place. There's pending litigation on the Remain in Mexico and possibly the metering system, but definitely Remain in Mexico and the transit ban. However, judges have refused to issue stays with regard to these policies, so they're in effect until the court ruling comes down, unless they say it's fine and then they may continue, right? So further uncertainty, waiting, I don't know what's going to happen. Civil society doesn't know what's going to happen. The migrants don't know what's going to happen. It reinforces this sense of uncertainty and fear and waiting, which has tremendous psychological effects. So I think there are quite a few health implications of the waiting part, in addition to all the other negative implications of these policies. So let me give a little bit of detail on a couple of them, and then I'm going to show a little 6-minute mini documentary on Remain in Mexico. So I'll do this really quickly. This is kind of complicated. Maybe you can share my PowerPoint with people, but it sort of is a nice diagram of how this works. And what we're talking about today is the expedited removal when you are apprehended at the border, or you ask for asylum without documentation, then you're sent into mandatory detention, and then several things can happen, right, for you to leave mandatory detention. You can get deported, you can be released because you have a sponsor, which is increasingly less and less likely. You can get asylum, but even if a judge grants you asylum, the government can appeal. And this is what we've been seeing with the few who've been granted asylum, who've been in the Remain in Mexico program. I think, well, this is at the end of a little documentary, but I'll preview it. Something like 11 have been granted asylum by a U.S. judge. In every single case, the U.S. government has appealed the decision. And I don't know whether anyone has been granted asylum that has won their appeal. I'm not sure that process is finished. So again, even for those few who managed to make it through that needle hole, more waiting, more uncertainty, compounding all the other moments of that. So this is a picture of La hielera. Hielo is ice in Spanish. So hielera is the ice, they call it the ice room. And this is a detention center where they send people after their credible fear interview, if they're not sent back to Mexico. And it's famous for being freezing cold. They keep these places, imagine intentionally really, really cold, and that's why they have these blankets, because they're freezing cold. They're so cold that that's the name of it, the ice box. The migrants call it the ice box. And obviously that's not, doesn't induce good health. And then you've heard about all the stories of the lack of access to toiletries and poor sanitation and people who are showing signs of illness and are just ignored. We've heard a lot of the horror stories of the conditions in these facilities. They're overcrowded. And I heard terrible stories of siblings not being able to comfort each other, being told that no, there's no touching. And there have been some recent reports that have come out about how many of particularly minors in these places have experienced sexual abuse, sometimes from other migrants, but also from the CBP officials. And there's apparently been, in 2018, 2019, there were 18 deaths in US immigration facilities. The number has been higher in previous years. It's gotten more media attention nowadays, but there's so much going on short of death, right? That is reprehensible. So these are just some statistics about family separation. And this shows the age and gender of the almost 3,000 children who were separated during the official policy. And as you can see, it's a not insignificant number of children under age 10. So these are babies, right? Small children, including babies. Although the majority are teens, preteens or teens. And then this shows where the separated children were held, to the degree that we have information on this. And you can see it's concentrated in certain parts of the country. Yeah.
Why so many more boys and girls?
I think because more boys are coming.
Was a big left behind. Is it safer or is it getting back?
That's a good question. I think it may be partly because the boys the unaccompanied minors are more likely to be boys. The girls are more likely to come with their families. And so that follows a kind of a historical pattern. But the gender distribution is different from anything we've seen in the past in terms of who is trying to cross the US-Mexico border. But yeah, still more boys than girls. All right, so this is just a couple of graphics on the metering system, and just to interpret because it's kind of small. So the top figure shows the number of people on these asylum wait lists over time. And so you can see it really went up that's May 2019 and August 2019 that have the highest numbers. And then it's come down a little bit, partly because of the shifts, particularly with the transit ban. You're not going to get asylum anymore. And then this is by location. So Tijuana had in November 2019 had almost 9,000 people on these lists. So you had a number 8,523 and people waiting for that number to come up. Ciudad Juarez is second and then Nogales is third. Those are the rest of the ports of entry. So it's not an insignificant number of people. 9,000 people waiting with no access to official. The Mexican government isn't doing anything. So it's all civil society providing shelter, health care, food. Many of them don't have documents to work. Some of them do. Many of them aren't authorized to work. So they're just sort of sitting around waiting in not terribly great conditions. And Tijuana actually has a quite well-developed civil society of migrant advocates and shelters. Some of these other cities don't even have that. So they're really overwhelmed by the numbers of people and the needs that they have. And then, last but not least, and this is where I'll transition to this little mini documentary that I want to show you. These are numbers for the Remain in Mexico program. And again, it goes up dramatically. In mid-2019, it's fallen again, partly because of the shift in US policy whereby you aren't eligible for asylum. But another backstory to all of this, which is worth keeping in mind, is what the Mexican government is doing. Right? So when the caravans were coming, and Trump basically, you may have read, threatened to slap tariffs on Mexico if they didn't stop the caravans. There was a brand new president in Mexico, Mexico's first leftist president. He came into office in December 2018, initially had fairly favorable policies. He provided transit documents to people so they could cross through Mexico more safely. Blew up in his face because Trump flipped out and threatened to slap tariffs on Mexican exports. And so AMLO, as he's known, the president of Mexico, responded by essentially doing exactly what Trump wanted. And increasing deportations of Central Americans back to Central America, calling out the brand new National Guard to detain people. The detention centers in Mexico are also overflowing with much worse conditions than the ones that we see along our border. So the problem has not gone away. The suffering has not stopped. It's gotten worse, but it's out of sight, out of mind here. Right? Politically, it's been solved. But the people are still experiencing these horrific conditions and this sense of uncertainty and fear and sort of facing danger and violence on all sides. And so this has gone down, but it's just the issue's been relocated. Right? And now we're starting to send people, Guatemalans back to El Salvador and Salvadorans back to Honduras. I mean, what are they going to do there? They don't even have asylum systems. Mexico has an asylum system, but it's completely overwhelmed. And they have fairly progressive asylum policies. Their definition of refugee is more generous than the international definition. Latin America has a broader definition that is sometimes applied, but they have like 4 offices, and the number of asylum claims has gone up exponentially in the last few years. So they're just overwhelmed. All right, let me show you this little video, which is kind of an excerpt of the longer film, which is almost an hour long. And these are just a few clips that I put together with some different music, focused on Remain in Mexico.
Could you just explain this graph, like what it's describing?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, and that's why I should give you the full number. So these numbers are the number of people sent back to wait in Mexico. And the total number as of December 2019 was almost 60,000 people have been sent back to wait for their court hearings in Mexico. So again, where are they going to live? How are they going to eat? How are they going to access health care? There's no official program by either government to take care of these people. Also, even less chance they're going to access legal counsel because they need U.S. lawyers. They're in Mexico, right? And you'll see some of this in this film. There's a little bit of a discussion of that.
So these, excuse me, you did show us that the preponderance of migrants were Mexicans in the beginning, and an increasing proportion of Central Americans in the last years. All of these numbers are non-Mexicans being sent back to Mexico. I was going to say, you'd have to have really good statistics to sort out who's a Mexican and who's claiming to be a Central American in that. I mean, what proportion of these do you think are Mexicans?
I think a very small proportion. From what I'm remembering, I think there have been some cases where they've sent Mexicans back under this program, which totally makes sense. Yeah. Right. But no, the vast majority are Central Americans. Initially, it was a program for Central Americans. Yeah. Now it's become broader, and so you'll have your occasional African or South Asian who gets caught up in this sent back, but it's predominantly Central Americans. And the asylum officers or CBP don't necessarily have a good enough Spanish to be able to figure out who's Mexican, who's Central American. But if you're a native Spanish speaker, it's pretty obvious, right? From accents, which they can try to learn how to hide, but it's not easy to do. It's not easy to pass, right? As a Mexican or Central American. All right, so I don't know quite.
So if you end the show, the video should, and minimize it, close it. There we go. Yeah, and you just hit play at the bottom.
Do you want to hit the lights? it's a little 6-minute thing, but hopefully we'll show you, humanize this a little more and illustrate some of the things that I've been talking about.
Effective immediately, the United States will begin the process of invoking Section 235(b)(2)(c), the Immigration and Nationality Act. Once implemented, individuals arriving in or entering the United States from Mexico illegally or without proper documentation may be returned to Mexico for the duration of their immigration proceedings. They will not be able to disappear into the United States.
Cuando entramos en la estación de migratoria, pues yo creí que ya todos dijimos, ya sí entramos a Estados Unidos. Gracias a Dios, pues todo ya se resolvió. Pero no fue así. La cosa fue diferente. Pues yo fui dando una entrevista a las 3 de la mañana. Y ahí me dijo el que me entrevistó, me dice que el caso lo vas a pelear en Tijuana. No puedes pelearlo aquí dentro de la estación de migratoria. Yo pues, cuando él me dijo esa noticia, a mí me dolió tanto por lo que he sufrido. Perder mi mujer, salir prófugo de mi país por algo que no puedo vivir, me puede quitar la vida. Cuando me dijo esas palabras, yo solo volteé a ver y le dije, pues, ¿qué se va a hacer?
So when you're expecting and you go somewhere that you're going to be there for 2 or 3 days, it's one thing. You're told, okay, you go for your interview, then you come back to Mexico for 45 days, and then you come back and you go back to Mexico for another 8 months. Well, that changes the perspective of a lot of things.
Tengo corte el 28 de marzo. Lo que dijeron fue que, o sea, en esa corte no es seguro de que uno entre a Estados Unidos, y que van a haber más cortes para pelear el caso. Un año.
The Remain in Mexico program, per the official party line, is to make sure that asylum seekers show up to court. However, having people remain in Mexico often ensures that they don't show up to court. For example, people are returned through the port of entry of Mexicali if they entered through Mexicali, which is 3 hours east of Tijuana, and those people will have court in San Diego. If they want to go to court in San Diego, they must show up at the port of entry in Tijuana, and there are no provisions, no financial provisions or transportation to help them get to the port of entry in Tijuana. And so that all that ensures that they won't show up for court.
En estas ciudades no se garantiza, nadie ha asumido la garantía de la seguridad que debe de tener un solicitante de asilo.
Todavía no he entrado a la entrevista, no he ido, apenas va a salir el número, y ya me quedan como 2 días, lo más sí. Pero ese temor de que te regresen aquí a México existe. Es algo que por el secuestro, el mismo motivo es lo que a mí me da temor. Camino como un león para adentro, salgo, estoy desesperado en esta situación. Al llegar la noche pues me siento cómodo porque cierro mis ojos, me acuesto. Pero hay algo que a la medianoche me despierta y me empieza a pensar.
Pues mire, la verdad es de que como traigo a mi sobrina, ella está desesperada, ¿verdad? Porque ella dice que vamos a hacer aquí. Ella dice que no conocemos a nadie. Le digo, sí, yo sé, le digo que no conocemos a nadie, me digo, pero le tenemos que echar ganas también porque ya estamos hasta aquí, le digo yo. Y casi la mayoría de gente no corre con la suerte que nosotros traemos de estar tan lejos hasta aquí. Pero mayoría dice de que es mejor se regresa, porque se la van a mandar, porque no quieren su país, no les gusta nada.
That's all I have. So see questions, comments?
Just what do you think is driving this crazy immigration policy? Is it Stephen Miller's racism, or is it, wanting to, affect the employment rate? Like, what is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would venture that it doesn't have a whole lot to do with economics at this point. I think it has more to do with a deep angst in certain segments of our population with the reality that we are soon going to be a majority minority country. That's my interpretation, is that these very opportunistic politicians, I mean, Stephen Miller is a true believer, and so his role is not to be discounted. But I think what they're doing is they're tapping into this deep anxiety that too many people in our country have about demographic changes and cultural changes, and immigration is sort of a low-hanging fruit for this, right? So that's my interpretation. So it's sort of a convergence of things that are happening, but this administration has been particularly willing to go to great lengths to sort of not just capitalize on this anxiety and fear, but to heighten it and to fuel it for their own political purposes. Yeah.
So on behalf of those 6,000 children, is there anything going through other federal courts or perhaps more importantly through international courts about rights violations?
I think there are. I'm not so familiar with those. I know there was some talk of taking the United States to international court. I mean, we're not a member of the International Criminal Court. We don't belong to a bunch of things, so it makes it a little more difficult. In terms of at the federal level, there are all sorts of lawsuits, and the organization that's really been leading the charge. So if you want to donate to somewhere, I highly recommend ACLU. They have been. There are a lot of other organizations, including Borlado, which you've heard the woman, she's a lawyer, talk about how this program is going to make it harder for them to go to court. They've been doing really great work as well, but the ACLU is sort of leading the charge in fighting against these policies, and I'm sure they have some court cases around the family separation. The ones I'm more familiar with are Grenada, Mexico, and the transit ban, which are still pending, right? So I don't know when decisions will. I think they've already argued their cases in court, so we're just waiting for the judges to rule.
How does this dovetail with the, and I'm less familiar with this, the fact that the Trump administration is reducing the number of visas that they're granting for seasonal workers such that places like Cape Cod, the crab industry in Maryland, and so on, cannot fill positions because they depend on that seasonal labor? How do the two of those go together?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of the story is that alternative avenues for people who are fleeing for many reasons, for them to come here, have been closed, shut, narrowed if not shut, right? So some of the folks who are asking for asylum might prefer to come on a seasonal worker visa, right? Even though they may have experienced violence and disruption in their community. So most of this is another thing that's really complicating, and it's one reason our legal definitions they have trouble matching reality. It's because most of this migration is what we call mixed migration, right? People are fleeing poverty, but they're also fleeing abuse and violence and extortion by gangs, et cetera, or drug traffickers. And apparently, I mean, I don't have personal experience with this, but I know a lot of people who work with asylum seekers, and they say that usually that when you first start asking them why they left, they talk about the economic reasons. You have to probe a little deeper because it's sensitive, it's personal. You have to probe a little deeper to discover that, oh, you know, their husband tried to kill them and they had to flee, right? So even because people are leaving for multiple reasons, and so I think some of them, if we had more avenues for legal labor migration, we wouldn't see the kind of pressure we're seeing on our asylum system, right? So that's part of the very complex situation that we're facing. So it's not helping, right? We all have to talk about migration as a balloon. You squeeze one side, and it's gonna. The underlying problem is not going away. In fact, we're making it worse because then we deport people back to their communities of origin. I don't know if you saw the report about the Salvadorans. Over 100 of them, I think, have been killed since they've been deported back to El Salvador. So exacerbating the conditions of insecurity that then cause people to leave. So until we kind of address the underlying conditions or fundamentally rethink mobility, this is just not going to go away. It's not going to get easier.
And it's made even worse by the fact that we've cut off our $8 to the very countries in the aid that is creating the conditions that is generating migration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's remarkably short-sighted, and I think it's because it's following a fundamentally political logic. And that's the problem with immigration policy in general, is it follows a political logic, not a sort of economic logic or any sort of rational logic other than what resonates politically most for those particular politicians. Any questions about, I'm not a health expert, but could you sense the anxiety in the few clips that you saw? Yeah, it was pretty palpable when we were doing the interviews. And you didn't even see the most intense one, where they talk about their journeys or why they left, and some of the body language is very evocative. I was telling to Ron that we initially didn't show faces because we wanted to maintain the confidentiality, but I think it's actually more powerful because you see the legs shaking and what people do with their hands sometimes is really powerful. So I actually think it makes it a more effective film that we aren't showing people's faces. You can see the body language.
Is a full film.
We're doing the final set of tweaks to it, and then hopefully I'll be able to show it here, but we're doing screenings. So I'm going to be going out to San Diego and Tijuana over spring break and screen it out there, which will be really interesting. Some of the folks in it will come. We did a pre-screening at Fletcher. I pre-screened it at a little migration conference in Mexico City, at a conference in Puerto Rico. So we're sort of at that phase of we've submitted it to a few film festivals, but those are almost impossible to get into. So far, no luck on that front. And we were thinking of, do we want to pitch it to PBS or so it won't be sort of freely available for a while. But if none of these things fly, I mean, we're not trying to make any money off of this, right? We really think it serves a educational and advocacy purpose. One thing we are doing though is we're building a website, and I can send you the link. I think it's going to go live on Friday, where we'll have this up there. We'll have some clips of testimonies. We'll have resources where you can get information, how to explain the asylum process. If you want to volunteer, if you want to donate, because one of the responses when we showed it at Fletcher was, okay, now I'm really upset. What do I do? I don't know what to do with this. So we said, okay, let's make a website and provide some of that information. So I'll once it's live, which I think will be tomorrow, I'll send you the link and you can check it out. And we're building it so it will get more have more content as time passes.
I really appreciate, the public communication work you try and do with your work and research. I also appreciated you going back historically. Immigration has been a mobilizing force, or anti-immigration, if you will. And, from what we've seen over the last 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, the central premise of, the Donald Trump's campaign was very much started with Mexicans are rapists, right? That was the central line that kind of launched. And so it's frightening. And I where I grew up in West Texas, I saw the power of this. This was empowering, which is terribly frightening, but not surprising. And the question I have is, what should the messaging be to humanize this issue? It seems to not, outside of very few moments where it'll capture the headlines for a short duration. I'm often shocked by how little it matters. Take, for example, the extension of the travel ban to Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. So many Nigerians didn't even make the top 5 headlines. That's enormous. One would think. That just, that's happened in the last couple of weeks. What messaging works? Is public health an angle? What is it that connects and breaks through the existing? Because from the opposite messaging is actually empowering. I think that is very obvious to me from what I've seen, and from what we've seen politically.
I wish I had an answer. I mean, I think it's the $64 million question. Is how to. I think the one of the reasons this issue, it's important in and of itself, and I'm obsessed with it, obviously. But I think it has a much broader importance because we are seeing this process of dehumanization, and we all know where that can lead. Very dangerous, and we've gone far down that path of dehumanizing certain types of people. How do you fight against that? I don't know. I mean, somehow we have to figure out how to get at least those who are fundamentally decent people, right, to see the humanity in people who are very different from them, right? And to also, I think part of the problem, the struggle in our cultural context with this, is this sort of, well, why don't they just get in line? Why don't they just do it the right way, like my grandparents did? People have no idea what that means. The line is insane.
People often don't know what their grandparents did.
Exactly. So this is one film we might want to make, actually. We've talked we're a team of 3. And we've discussed the idea of doing a film where we choose sort of 3 older people or people who had parents who came across in the 40s or 50s and what their experience was like, and then 3 were it's anecdotal, but just to kind of bring home the absurdity of that kind of reasoning, right? The sort of law and order mentality, which is super, super deep and strong in this country. And I think that's one of our challenges.
Well, it seems like the other piece that's mixed up in here and going on from the Clinton years of welfare reform through Obama's deportations, which, in the Cambodian community was and continues to be no picnic, is also this sort of idea of weeding out the worthy from the unworthy. Yes. I mean, we do it within our own social services, we do it within this context, and I mean, that's a rabbit hole. I mean, how do you dismiss or make people real? I mean, because like the economic migration, is that worthy or unworthy? I mean, right there, I think is sort of the central ground for that, where sometimes it's worthy, sometimes it's unworthy. I mean, and then we have our own fears about making sure that we don't give away our resources so that we lose our strength somehow to be able to provide for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's
the fear, but you're going to sort that out by separating worthy from unworthy. Well, maybe we can do a little, but only for the ones who deserve it. So like accepting refugees from Southeast Asia and then putting them into situations where kids join gangs to protect themselves, and then when they're 30 and have straightened themselves out, deporting them because of something that happened when they were 8. I mean, it's like, it's insanity.
Yeah. No, I think you're onto something really important. And I think what we're seeing now from the Trump administration is that they're all unworthy. So sort of whitewashing that whole thing. But I think that the Democratic Party fully engages in this, the good immigrants versus the bad immigrants. Partly because they sort of feel like they have to cover themselves to show that they're tough on immigration and they're in law and order and control border and all that. But I think that is dangerous. So DACA used to be, those were the good immigrants, the DACA recipients. They were okay. But then, then there are the bad immigrants that you don't want to have anything to do with. So it can be convenient politically if you're to protect a segment of this population, but it also, there's a cost, I think, because it plays into this broad brush kind of moralistic language and categorization that can create very negative outcomes on the ground, particularly if there's no sort of compassion and understanding of the life cycles and that people get in difficult circumstances and can be doing their best and still don't qualify as a good migrant. Yeah.
There's just something, I know we're past time, but there's just something so painfully ironic to, people are coming here because we are the beacon of safety and justice. And that's the part that it just sort of like, I think that ripping at a lot of people right now is that, like, who are we? America, who are we?
Some of it, they didn't end up even in the longer film. But one of the refrains that we heard over and over again, which broke my heart. Two. One is a lot of the asylum seekers from Central America are very religious, either Catholic or a lot of them are actually evangelical. And so you hear over and over again, well, if God willing, it's in God's hands. He'll take care of me. And so I think it's one reason they keep coming, even though the chances of actually getting asylum are teeny. They also get misinformation from smugglers. I mean, there's a lot going on. But part of it is, maybe it'll be me. It's in God's hands. Si Dios quiera. And then the other one that was even more broke my heart is, but if Trump if he just sees, he has a family, if he just sees that we're good people, he'll change his mind. And I was like, no, not in 20 years.
He'll never be worthy.
Exactly. I mean, it's heartbreaking. Yeah.
I'm glad you raised the issue of the smugglers, because this comes back to the point about Nigeria. I don't know this for sure, but the Nigerian ban, I believe in part was in response to a request from Canada. Because I don't know if you know, but that for the past few years, smugglers, people traffickers have been recruiting people in Nigeria, they get a visa into the United States, and go through all of the paperwork to get a visa into the United States, which means you need to have your paperwork in order. Arrive in New York, they get on a bus and they go and they cross the border in Quebec, which is just north of Darby, Franconia, up north of St. Johnsbury. And the law is that if they cross the US-Canadian border illegally, they are immediately detained by the RCMP, put into a hotel, that's detention in Canada, put into a hotel, and by doing that, then their paperwork is processed on a much faster track. So the Quebec government was going crazy, and the Canadian government requested that the US not give visas to these Nigerians because they were deporting 99% of them. They accepted very few. But not only that, they had arrived, and according to law, if they wanted to declare asylum, they should have done so in the United States. But the traffickers were specifically had figured out what the laws were, bringing them legally into the United States, and instead of taking them up through a border, taking them across a field in Quebec. And so Quebecers just said, okay, coming back to this, get in line. We're processing Syrian refugees right now, and trying to get them integrated in, and we don't want to have to deal with this because this is bumping the Syrians out of the line. So in a sense, what I wanted to say is that the role of smugglers here, and the role of smugglers in the south of Mexico, where I have done a lot of work and still have a lot of friends, it has created chaos in Chiapas. But these are gangs that are making money out of this and moving people through from all over the place. And I think that that's part of the story.
Yeah.
That they're taking money for people and promising them something, and then bringing them in because they've figured out a route. And And so right now, the situation in south of Mexico is dreadful.
No, I'm glad you highlighted the mention of smuggling, because it is enormous, it's complicated, it's a real issue and problem. But I also would argue that our restrictive policies have made it so much worse.
Oh, yeah.
I gave a talk, I guess it was last year at Fletcher, and I came up with my favorite little catchphrase, which was, every time a border closes, a smuggler gets a raise. Because,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So again, we're sort of creating the very problem we're claiming to be fighting against,
Exactly.
by making it so difficult and dangerous and scary to migrate, that you have to hire an increasingly sophisticated, well-financed.
Or they're going out and recruiting. They've got businesses.
Right,
They're
right.
recruiting them. It isn't the asylum seekers looking for them, they're looking for the asylum seekers.
Yeah, no, it's gotten to that,
Yeah.
that point. And that sort of gets wrapped up in caravans. It's very complicated, but unfortunately, the public isn't very good at processing nuance. And if you say smuggler, forget it, forget humanization.
And I don't have any data to support my position that the Canadian government asked the US.
I don't know.
So let Rob.
Okay, great. So, well, I got that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that's great. Yeah, no, that was great. And I just thought.
Yes, I did. And I sent an email around that I would miss it.
No, I know that. We did not to accept you. I'm just saying that it was really good.
Oh, good. Well, I'll stay away then in the future.
I don't know what your schedule is like.
For April.
That's a Wednesday. So, okay.
And then I also.
So, well, it was gonna be around like 4 to 6 p.m. and
Oh,
we
yeah.
thought it was gonna be like, and our thought was, we're basically waiting for Monday, we're gonna have a meeting with medical students. Is to really have providers and individual perspectives, where we're gonna have healthcare providers from one Chinatown community, but also from those who work in more Latinx focused community health centers to sort of comment on their experiences with what we're facing, potentially to have community perspectives, some people from the community, like person speaking to help us them in their lives, whether it's their healthcare or stress or whatever it is. So that's what we're planning. I'm waiting to see what the students say, because many of them work indirectly in some of these health centers, and we're hoping to have, I would prefer social workers who would be able to speak, because they're usually the kind of front line. I, as a physician, prefer social worker. I don't know what to do with all the surrounding social perspectives, social issues that people are facing. But to have social workers and people from the community, and so that we were thinking that might be a forum, like say right after that, to show your film for people who want to stay. So that's it's a event, and then it leads into dinner and a movie kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I'd be.
So what I was thinking is I can let you know more after Monday, because we do want the students to have a big voice in how they want this to be shaped. And a bunch of us are meeting with the students or a bunch of the student groups are meeting with us on Monday. And so after that, I think we'll have an idea. But if that sounds appropriate, that was one thought we had.
And as far as I know, that date and time should work.
Okay, and I'll send it, I'll just confirm it to be sure, but I believe it's April 8th. It's Public Health Week, the day after World Health Day, so it's a World Health Day event, but sort of also the culmination of this speaker series for Tuesday. Cool?
That would be great.
Sorry, I should let you eat.
That's okay, no. So another reason I would be interested in coming to that event, participating, is that, you know Karen Jacobson?
Yes, yeah, I've seen her name, so.
Yeah. So we both teach migration classes in the fall.
Okay.
And we've been talking a lot at Fletcher about building up the experiential component of and so I think we're going to apply, hopefully Tufts will give us some money to develop, we're calling it right now the migration lab.
Okay.
So the idea, I think it'll be sort of a pilot, and we might have make students apply and then maybe choose 5 for each of our classes and then place them somewhere in the community working on something having to do with immigration.
That's great, yeah, yeah.
So sort of meeting some folks who are working in the public health space on
Yes,
immigration
yeah.
could be really useful.
Yeah. No, that's a great, hopefully that'll be a great intersection. I mean, we should have at least a couple of people representing direct healthcare provision, right? So immigrant health clinics are health clinics in Chinatown that deal with our local population here because we're right in the midst of Chinatown. So that's always important to us on the medical campus side. It's our local community. Yeah, so hopefully those would provide some lead-ins. We were thinking about being a little broader, but just the time constraints has been a challenge in the sense like we don't want too many speakers. Alice's cousin has actually had the teachers union. Obviously, this is affecting a lot of students.
Yeah.
So we thought that might be a really interesting perspective to bring in to speak to what they're doing from their end on the education side of what students are facing. So it's something we're toying with, but I'm waiting, for the sake of democracy, I'm waiting until Monday because our I think the Global Social Life Students Association, as well as some of the Global Health Students Association, are both going to be sort of kind of spearhead